Hello, everybody. So this week we're going to look at financing education adequately. So we have a couple of questions driving this discussion here. Why have education costs increased, and what happens if we do not address the rise in these costs? So let's lay the foundation a little bit for education in America. We're talking about America here. And just get some basic idea of what we're talking about when we talk about the education industry. So first of all, you can see there is a huge societal impact on educational needs. One thing to keep in mind is education is big business in the United States, and as administrators, you guys will be bombarded. Doesn't matter what school you're in, whether it's a large urban school, nice suburban school, or a small rural school that serves 250 students. You're going to be bombarded with all kinds of information because education is big business in the United States. I like to refer to all this as the educational industrial complex. And those of you who are familiar with history a little bit will recognize the reference to Dwight Eisenhower there. But in my opinion, we certainly have an educational industrial complex that has taken over the role of education, and we will see be continued to be played out even more. Education is a major user of the nation's economic resources, and one of every four people in the United States is involved in education in some way. Um, when you think about it, education is typically the largest single item in any state budget, and for Oklahoma, that's very true. Education receives about 34.1 or 2% of our state budget, easily the single highest um, um, recipient of the state budget as far as a group. So education is big business, okay, and therefore changes that come to education are going to be slow, and because it is such a big business, as we will see and discuss in time, will be costly. The increases that we're seeing as far as cost of education are related to things such as increasing and changing enrollment of students. We know that in Oklahoma we have continued to cut education. Currently, we are number one in the country as far as the state and how much we've cut education budget. But our enrollment continues to rise at a pretty steady pace of about 6,000 students a year in the state. And so even though we have made drastic cuts, um, our enrollment continues to rise. And as we'll see, we're enrolling a lot of different students. They're not the same uh, students that we've typically seen in the classroom, white, middle class Protestant students. As a result, we have increasing programs and services provided. Certainly, we have a large growing population of ESL students, and not just that, but many more low-income students and so forth. Changing rates of inflation, we'll touch on that just a little bit. Um, Inequities in quantity and quality of educational services provided, um, and we will get into that a little bit later as well when we're talking about uh, equity and equal access. Those are two important concepts that we will continue to stress off and on throughout our course, and so we will come back to that as well. So some problems then. Um, Again, this kind of reiterates the previous slide. Causes of serious financial problems in public education anticipated. It's not just in Oklahoma that we see growing populations, but it's all across the country. And then causes of financial problems not anticipated. High cost programs for students that are low income, disabilities, English learners, effective bargaining for higher salaries, cost of new expensive federal and state programs, and expanded public preschool. Now, Oklahoma is unique in our approach to preschool. We certainly believe in it and push that forward much more than many other states do. Okay, but you can see that these are going to put strains on financial resources for education, and so the only way that we can adequately absorb these new pressures is consequently increase the funding that's going to education as these new pressures arise, and that has not been happening. As we see, obviously states are struggling with equity issues, and the public is resistant to taxes, certainly in Oklahoma. So just to give you some idea on some demographic changes, in 2010, 75.2 million students were enrolled in preschool through college, PK to 16. 75.2 million people. We have about 350 million people in the United States. 92,000 schools, 15,000 school districts, 4.7 million teachers, 5.4 administrators, and support staff, and then other. I'm assuming that's 5.4 million administrators and support staff. Projected by 2018, of course that's just a year away from us here, 59.8 million students projected for pre-K to 12, overall enrollment increase of 8% compared to 2009. Regional projection increase in enrollment vary, as you can see. We can see where growth is happening in the United States here. The South, 18% increase. The West, 14.7%. The Midwest, pretty steady. In the Northeast, slowing down. And obviously, all you have to do is go into Texas and look at the school districts in Texas and see how huge so many of their districts are in Texas. And they're just growing at incredible rates. Just to give you some numbers and some current expenditures, now this is a little bit old data. 2010 to 11 includes funding for operations and maintenance, personnel, benefits, utilities, but not facilities. Okay, we're not building schools with this money. In 2010 and 11 for PK-12, this was $532 billion, $500 billion in education in this 1 year. So you can see why we said that education is a big business. On average in America, the average cost per pupil or expense money paid per pupil, $11,397. It ranges from a high of $22,115 in Vermont down to $6,708 in Arizona. And again, these are 2010-11 numbers. I would anticipate that Oklahoma is dropped down closer to the bottom, if not at the bottom, and Arizona's probably kind of stayed steady. So just to give you a little background on why we are where we are in education funding. And I give this speech a little bit in all my classes as it comes up. So, just bear with me if you've heard this. It's always good repeating so you can have an idea of education in American history. Of course, we know that education is a state issue. The federal government really did not get involved in education until the 1960s when Lyndon Johnson introduced the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, in 1965 and put over $13 billion into funding education. And this is where you get all your title programs, such as Title I for low-income students. And it's continued ever since. And then we see in the early 70s, we start having court cases and an emphasis in two additional areas, that of special education and that for students where English is a second language. And so as a result of that, schools are investing even more in the process of education. And so this continues through the late 60s, second half of the 60s into the 70s, and you're adding these other areas. And then in the early 80s, when Ronald Reagan comes into the presidency in 1980, 1981 actually, he has, and by the way, the U.S. Department of Education was also formed in the late 70s under President Carter. So immediately thereafter, we get President Reagan, and President Reagan, in his administration, they issue a Nation at Risk. This was the first look at education in this comprehensive manner because we're spending all this money through federal programs as a result of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the bilingual work we're doing, the special education work we're doing. So we want to look at our schools. And A Nation at Risk comes out in about 82 or 83. And some things in The Nation at Risk said, the name says it all, how it views schools. Our schools are in trouble. And as a result, it came out with some recommendations. So some of the recommendations may sound familiar to you, and these came back from the early 80s. The first one here, hold educators and elected officials responsible for providing leadership necessary to achieve goals. So this is an early idea of somehow tying accountability into education. It's not going to get any teeth into it, obviously, until another 20 years. But A Nation at Risk started this idea, and then citizens provide support and stability required to bring about the reforms, inviting more input from non-educators, in other words. So I mentioned that Lyndon Johnson passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965. Every president thereafter, more or less, renewed that act, and as it renewed, it took on different names of whatever the president had done to it. And so the idea of holding educators accountable we see come with A Nation at Risk in the 80s. And so one of the ways that that was seen to be able to do would be to create standards. And so in the 80s, we get a standards movement really gathering steam and support. And we move into the 90s, and Bill Clinton, President Clinton, reauthorizes the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. I always forget the name that it took under him. But he introduced this idea of standards, and they actually looked at national standards. But there were other things happening early in his administration. One of the biggest things early on was Hillary Clinton and her work with health insurance, and so there was a lot of controversy over the first national standards issue, and so they kind of stepped back from the national standards at the national level, but they still continued. And of course, by this time in Oklahoma, we had standards, we had state standards by this time. So we ramble on a little bit until we get to President Bush. And of course, President Bush reauthorizes the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and pulls in this information from the early 80s with the Nation at Risk. And of course, when he does, it's renamed No Child Left Behind. And the biggest difference here is that finally there's accountability tied to education. And so then we ramble on through that and get up to President Obama. And President Obama had raced to the top. And one of the things, that's not his reauthorization, he just introduced race to the top. And one of the things that he did with that was tie even more accountability into education. And then we finally get to the end of his term with ESSA, Every Child Succeeds Act, or Every Student Succeeds Act. And so that is finally the new face of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So we no longer have No Child Left Behind. Now we have Every Student Succeeds. And so that's the most recent iteration of ESEA. Okay, but again, it all goes back to the federal government. And so I give you all that history because if you think about it, as these new faces and new realities within education surfaced, the idea is that in order to adequately address them, funding would have to increase with these new realities, and not just as a normal piece of funding increase, but in addition to the natural increase that goes with inflation and so forth, and that has not happened. Okay, that just hasn't happened. So even though all that has not happened, and that's why we find ourselves where we are today, struggling to ask ourselves, what do we do with our um, educational problems, such as special education students, students from low income, students who don't speak English. What do we do with them? Because what the public sees is, again, education is the number one industry, usually in a state, but yet we're facing these problems. And so that's why the public is not informed of the fact that education as a public institution has not kept up with the changing of the times. So anyway, that's a little bit of history there for you. There have been some gains made, though, in the last 2 years, and a book I would recommend to you is Diana Ravage's most recent book, The Reign of Error. And in the beginning of that book, she really talks about the fact that we are more successful now than we were 20 years ago. We do have fewer students dropping out of school. We definitely have higher, tougher courses being offered at higher level in school. Students today are taking and earning as much as an associate's degree before they even leave high school. And that wasn't the case 25 years ago when I was in high school. We have improved SAT and ACT scores. We have improved math and science achievement. And we have more students going to college. So we are addressing the changing demographics and the system is working. The question is the system working adequately for all? And that's when the issues of equal access to an education and equitable treatment within the education system will come into play as we go through our course. So that kind of basically gives the underlying principle of why we say education deserves a higher priority. But keep in mind from the first presentation that this is a cyclical relationship where we see the public sector providing students and training that go into the private sector, and then the private sector increases production and in turn produces more taxes which go into public education, and that cycle continues. And so public schools, like all other government entities, are reliant upon a tax base. And so there are those who look and see, again, it goes back to that idea that we're spending a third of the state budget, the single highest individual budget item goes into education, and we're still seeing issues. In spite of those gains, we're still seeing issues. And so people are opposing giving any more money into the education system. And as we know, this obviously has injurious results on the system. The losers in this battle as it continues are obviously the field of education. In the big picture, the nation loses as a whole. When we talked in the first part of the course, we talked about the goal of public education to instill moral values such as fairness, and things like that, and also to instill patriotism and pride in the country. If our educational system starts hurting, then obviously those products of it will also suffer, and therefore the nation as a whole will suffer just on that point. But on a bigger point, especially here in Oklahoma, where we see we have a large number of impoverished students, we suffer because we're not producing that human capital that fit into that model. And so it's not just the private sector balking on throwing more capital, more tax revenue into education. They're looking at the result of saying the education or the public sector is not producing the human capital necessary for the private sector to work. And so it's a catch-22, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? So what comes first here, the lack of resources or the lack of training in producing human capital? And in a lot of ways, it could become a philosophical argument, I think, but it's all tied to funding, obviously. Major school problems most frequently cited by those who oppose increased taxes to support education, a lack of financial support, drug problems in schools, and a lack of discipline in schools. We talked about the fact that the costs of education are on the increase, and it's not just due to the things that we mentioned, such as increased students and the needs of students. It's also due to just the natural cost of living. Okay, and on top of that, so we have the changing costs in our student population, the natural cost of living, and then higher expectations. So when we talk about changing goals and objectives, we're talking about higher expectations for students. If we want to prepare students today to be college and career ready, then at least on that college side, we have to train students that can move into the college atmosphere, which means providing even higher course and higher learning, higher level courses in high school, much more than ever was in the past. So those kinds of things have changed. So these goals are more comprehensive, more costly. We have increased accountability. We have increasing student population, increasing expectations and needs, and so on. So you can see why there are different reasons for the higher costs in education. Some problems, again, these things are also contributing to why we don't have the money we think we should have in education, or why a better way to state this would be why the money we have is not going as far as expected. Well, one of the things is the effect of inflation. Okay, the dollar cost of education is rapidly rising. People reduce purchase of goods and services, desiring to reduce their tax burden. Scarcity of high cost of energy, need for more energy efficient construction and maintenance procedures. When I go in and work in schools, it's a big issue when we're talking with schools, and the schools are faced with trying to build new buildings, new facilities, or if they can't afford to build new facilities, then they have to look at the facilities that they currently have and get on a preventive maintenance program. And that's typically what we see happen, is that preventative maintenance program, especially when you get into urban areas. The cost of building a school versus a preventative maintenance program is much higher. And as dollars are extremely tight, districts typically go for the lowest cost. And so you see a lot of money being expended on things that if we just put more investment up front, we wouldn't have to worry about that preventative maintenance. And in the end, it would catch up and the money would go further. And then finally, another impact on the cost of education are the social indicators, the fluctuation in the type of families that we have, much more single-parent families, income, growth rates of household and school population. So all those kinds of things are adding to the changing costs of education. And this is not lost on the public. PDK, Phi Delta Kappa, is an organization that puts out an education journal every month or 6 weeks. I can't remember how often I get them. But every year, PDK always does a poll on the public attitudes of public schools. And the polls are real interesting, okay? Because the public generally tends to say, or the public generally tends to say, that that they want improvement in public schools. That in general, schools have a lot of area for improvement. Interestingly enough, though, when asked about their own home school, they typically rate their own home schools as being pretty adequate. So that's a little bit of an interesting thing to consider there when looking at it. But those are typical results that always come out of this poll every year. And the polls also reveal that the public realizes that one of the biggest concerns in education is this idea of funding. So just to kind of reiterate and look specifically, one of the reasons for this increase in funding, and again, this is just not the natural increases or anything, this is the changing student thing, the changing demographics of students. We know that we have increasing enrollments, shortage of buildings, classrooms, especially as we have migrant students moving around. I've been in districts where schools are set at 1,400 students, and they have over 1,800. And the only way they can do it is put them in portable buildings. And part of that's because the increased natural population growth in the city, but you also have people migrating and moving into the city, moving away from the rural areas. I'm talking specifically Oklahoma here. And so schools are forced then to put up portable buildings because, again, they're on a preventative maintenance facility plan as opposed to trying to save. It's not that they don't save money; it's that they don't get the support to build new facilities. Okay, so the facilities become inadequate and obviously a need for more teachers and staff. It was a sad day when they withdrew the requirement for Oklahoma school teachers, the maximum number of students you could have in a class, and or you could teach in a day. And I think it was about 120. It's pretty low compared to some other states. I've seen them up as high as 160. But due to the budget cuts, they took that away. So the result then is that teachers, as natural attrition happens and teachers leave the system, schools, in order to save money, don't hire teachers and simply distribute students. And so now we have classes of 35 to 40 students due to the lack of adequate funding. And talking about those students, again, we've talked about the fact that many are disadvantaged students, economically disadvantaged. We have more disabled students that we're trying to educate, and we certainly have a growing number of bilingual students. And most schools in Oklahoma aren't that tough on the bargain for higher salaries, but in other states that does have a huge impact. And then the unfunded mandates that come from the state and the feds and implementing desegregation programs. Again, we don't see a lot of that in Oklahoma. I've been in school districts. They're typically large urban school districts that are under federal order uh, to uh, place rules for desegregation, uh, to desegregate their districts. And in school law, we'll talk about the green factors and how these things come into play as far as school law and desegregation of schools. So obviously then the end result here is when you're required to start programs without additional monies, uh, those programs become watered down. You lose the quality of the program, and it's never going to match what it was on paper or in somebody's head. And therefore schools are seen as lacking as a result, when in reality, most likely they couldn't have achieved what's on paper uh, from the beginning because the support wasn't there. So a little bit on the demographic changes as far as facilities go and the cost of facilities. There are a couple of things that happen as students move around within urban areas from one school to another. What we see as a natural result of that is um, we see number two, overcrowded classrooms and teacher to pupil to teacher ratios that are very high. And on the other side of that, in the schools that students are fleeing, we see partially occupied classrooms and small pupil to teacher ratios. But again, it would take um, an effort, and it's not an effort, it would take a financial contribution to address those things when the state continues to cut funding. It's just not, the district is just not able to address the reasons that students are leaving schools all the time. And instead of closing the school uh, and forcing all the students to leave, you keep all the schools open, or you keep most of the schools open, and you see this imbalance. And so this, of course, leads to inefficiency in funding as far as the facilities issue is concerned. We talked about this already. So how do we measure academic success? And I don't know how much we'll talk about this, but I want to mention it here. And we talked about equity and what that means. Equity means treating unequals unequally until they're equal. And, personally, while there are parts of accountability that I certainly agree with, I think you have to have goals and you have to be able to reach those goals. Or if you don't reach those goals, then you look for the inefficiencies that cost you not to reach those goals and you address those. And it just makes the system work in a much smoother and more efficient manner. Okay. So one of the ways that we measure accountability, of course, is tied to testing. And so one of the things I want you to keep in mind is, and I don't know the answer to this dilemma here, but our testing situation is, and it's been a while since I've read a bunch of stuff on this, but I still think it's the same. Our testing situation is based on a white middle class world, and that's not the same world that we're teaching anymore. And so when the book talks about test scores based on higher income, education level of parents, fewer siblings, higher educational expectations, that's the background for testing that we try to measure accountability for. And so what we're trying to do is get students up to this level. And the more and more students who come into our system who view this as a foreign territory, it takes more and more resources, not just financial resources, but certainly financial resources, to introduce them to this concept of what we view as a white middle class world and get them ready to be able to pass these quote unquote signs of achievement. So anyway, that's why we talk about test scores and the bias, in my opinion, that are there. But then again, like I said, I don't know what the solution is. But we know part of the problem, and that's part of the problem. The consequences of not educating people adequately. So what happens then, and this is where some more equity issues come in, and what happens is governments, whether it's a federal or state government, pull money away, and they're already schools are already suffering due to lack of taxes going through them, especially in Oklahoma. And so what happens is the government comes in and says, if schools can't do their job, then we're going to allow alternative routes. And so in essence, what's happened is even more money is then pulled away from schools. And on the surface, these other ideas such as vouchers and charter schools sound like freedom of choice you'll hear. And of course, this obviously gets into the political side of it. You can't talk about school funding without talking about the political side of it, in my opinion. What happens is students who are able to take advantage of those situations do. And sometimes they succeed, sometimes they don't. But not all students are able to take advantage of those situations for one reason or another. And so that as a treatment to the problem in schools is a completely unfair practice, because not all students can take the opportunity as it's presented to them. And so we end up with even a wider gap between those who are adequately educated and those who are not. And so here are some consequences of not educating our citizenry adequately. A rise in illiteracy. And as we know, literacy is the foundation for success, for being productive. You have to be literate to go to the next level, and then if you want to go on to earn a graduate degree, literacy is the foundation for all this. But the rise in illiteracy is a problem with a lack of education. We know that unemployment is closely related to a lack of adequate education. During the Great Recession, those who suffered the most were those with the lowest education. There's a direct correlation to that. You are incapable of military service if you have a lack of an adequate education, and your chances of going to prison increase dramatically with the lack of an education. And so we know then that those kinds of things perpetuate not only their own variables, such as once somebody's in prison, I would think the chances of somebody, their offspring going to prison are higher. And so these kinds of things, unfortunately, just continue to perpetuate. Just to give you an idea, unemployment rates, 28 years old and over by the highest level of education. In 2008, so this was the beginning of the Great Recession, you can see here people with less than a high school diploma, the unemployment rate was 9%. And you go all the way up to people with a bachelor's degree, the unemployment rate is 2%. So it unfairly hits those people with a lack of education. So continuing on, consequences of not educating people adequately. They are not prepared for the job force, which impacts their quality of life, which, if there are enough of them in an area, Sometimes about 15% is what we look at when we talk about critical mass. Um, if you can get 15% of the people to buy into an idea, you reach critical mass, and the idea will gain momentum. Doesn't mean it'll pass. It means it'll gain momentum. Up until that, it's just kind of floating around. I think the same concept could be to economic development in an area that has poorly um, educated. Once you reach that critical mass of 15% or so of your population that's poorly educated, then that begins to take over, and people begin to think this is the way it is, and it's okay that this is the way it is. Uh, and so that then leads into the last bullet, which erodes ultimately, in the big picture, the nation's democracy and the economic competitiveness of our country. And we see things like this happening even now, um, in the current political state and in previous political situations. Um, Unfortunately, what we see on the news when we see people uh, who can't name a Supreme Court justice, or people who can't uh, name a foreign country, or have been to a foreign country, or been out of their own state. Uh, these are all due to a lack of education and following this pattern here. So anyway, you get the idea of what I'm saying. Moving on, dependence on public relief. Again, we know that a lack of education, and following these three and previous ideas, the result of that is that uh, people become more dependent on public relief. And so it's a vicious cycle. And as you become more dependent on public relief, uh, if you can't break the cycle, then it leads into other areas here. High health costs, we know that, again, contributing to this cycle of poverty, um, a lack of education leading into this cycle. We know that high health costs without health insurance, and obviously, again, this gets very political, uh, increases the health issues that the citizenry will face, and as those health issues aren't taken care of, again, these things just continue to perpetuate this cycle of poverty. Really, that's what it is. It's a cycle of poverty that becomes generational, okay, without adequately educating people. In the end, we see that society suffers from poor education. So it's not just that it's one or two people here and there. Once we reach that critical mass, then it starts to impact society. Um, and here's where I think that there's a lot of controversy, because it's been left unchanged. And as a result, now, in order to address the problems we have in education, it's going to take a significant larger investment. And people are unwilling to do that, as we saw. Uh, the problems of providing adequate and high quality education are all across the board at all levels, local, statewide, and national. But again, in order to address this and change this mindset, we have to get past that concept that education is the single highest receiver of finances, and if it can't manage what it's doing now, then we're not going to give it any more tax money, because education as an institution has really never received the adequate tax money that it's needed in the past 60 plus years, since we've been concentrating on trying to educate all students in society. Uh, So a few questions of priorities here. This is our last slide. So no clear-cut evidence that investment in education is paying off. The culture of immediacy. We want things right now. So keep that in mind. And we talked about this in the last presentation. Is we don't have that smoking gun that says pouring money into education will solve these issues. And I don't know that we're going to get that, but when we look at all those other variables and see that continuing down certain ways, like I said, once somebody goes to prison, the chance that their children will go to prison increases. And just the opposite of that is true. Once you go to college, the chance that your offspring will go to college increases. And so what we have to do is be able to work in and change those different little variables. And it's a long process. And so there's not going to be this immediate result of it that we see change. But what we have to see is enough investment to offset all the different types of changes that we talked about that we see in education. And then another thing that we have to keep in mind is the different brands of accountability, and whether we're talking about a state accountability, a federal accountability, or even on a local level. So when we take those things into consideration, that's when we can really ask the question, are we adequately funding? And if not, how do we get there that we can treat all students? So it's a very interesting chapter, a lot of philosophical ideas in there, and I hope that you enjoyed reading that. So next presentation, we'll talk about equity itself in education funding.